My name is William Brown. I'm a senior software engineer at SUSE Labs in Australia. I live in Queensland and Brisbane, which is a very long way away. So unfortunately, I did manage to get myself, my immune system compromised and feeling a bit sick, which meant that I wasn't here yesterday. Now, my day job, I'm actually a member of the 389 directory server team, which is also sold as a product called Red Hat Directory Server. It's part of FreeRPA. And instead, I'm here at a Samba conference talking to you about Samba, which seems a little bit self-defeating. I'm talking about my potential competitor's product. But previously, before that, I was a system administrator. And I worked for the University of Adelaide, which is a moderately sized educational institute in Australia, and I worked there in their IT department for 7 years. So a lot of this talk is coming from a background of that, that infrastructure lens and how that interacts with our servers and systems. And so there's going to be a bit of history here, because when I first started at the university, we were on the tail end of things like, larger mainframes and Sun and your big iron systems. Now, this led to a very certain way of designing a network, managing it, how your system administrators and developers interacted with those systems. Now, there was, a lot of thin clients, managed systems, and this led to very static kind of configurations. And around this time, there was a lot of interesting ideas around the way that organizations could trust one another. And this is reflected in how the servers, how the protocols were designed in that time. If we're looking at standards going from X500 up and, things like Kerberos, there was a lot of ideas of, every large number of businesses and systems around the world will trust each other. And that hasn't really eventuated, with the exception of Eduroam. And so this was all kind of embedded in the way that those systems really worked. Now, because of the way that these systems were bought, you'd go out to Sun or whichever other vendor, and you would say, here is my briefcase full of money, please design me a system. And they would come back to you with a server that was expected to last 5 years. In case of network infrastructure, it was designed to last 10. So what this led to was really static, well-controlled networks, something like this. Now, I don't know how many of you are system administrators versus software engineers, but people love their diagrams. Like, everyone loves making up these Visio diagrams for networks. Now, and of course, these can only exist if you have a very static system. And the university network that I worked in actually looked pretty similar to this. You had your border routers, your cores, and it went off and everything else. There was very little churn in a system like this. You could expect things to stay in a certain way. Machines would always be on the same IP and DNS name. And that led to a certain way of thinking. And as a result, business, and due to the cost of machines, the machines were part of the business. So machines became part of the trust relationship between users and organizations. You would go into, say, for example, university, and you would log into a workstation that was controlled by the business, and then the machine would authenticate to the KDC, and then you would authenticate through that, and then everyone was verified that the machine was valid, you were valid, and the servers were valid. And some businesses still absolutely operate this way. Banking is a really good example. Some workstations, universities, aviations, ISPs especially have very long-lived systems. But then the cloud came along, and the cloud has really changed the way that, especially from a system administrator perspective, the way that businesses work and treat applications. You don't have as much in-house development. A manager will go to a third party and they will deliver COTS applications, which is common off the shelf, I think. And they will run as software as a service or platform as a service. You have people who are in businesses doing things like starting to migrate their infrastructure onto AWS. And these systems are very dynamic, and they run in a very different way than our traditional networks. And a lot of this came along with a very web-centric and web-first mindset. Every application, you'll have an application which may be running on somebody else's infrastructure, and your only method of accessing it is through a web system. Now, this doesn't work in the same way as our traditional applications have worked, and so this really changed things. And along with this, we were also starting to see a lot of businesses adapt bring your own device. Now, I used to also work at Red Hat, and they very much had you could self-administer your workstation policy. Working at university, you've got 25,000 students on campus who are all bringing their own machines, and they still have to authenticate to your services. So this is really changing things. Now, another thing that really came along that has absolutely disrupted, in air quotes for people who are on the audio recording and can't see my sarcasm, something else that's really caused a big change was containers. And the way that we now deploy and run code in these environments. And containers are a very different way of managing your systems and deploying your code. And they're very dynamic. And we're starting to see container management systems like Kubernetes and OpenShift, which are akin to the way that you would have something like a virtualization environment to run your VMs. Kubernetes is basically a framework which manages distributed resources and deploys them with containers. And again, these provide highly dynamic, very changing systems. In the past, we used to expect a machine to last for 5 years. Now we're looking at enterprises where they're running a container for 10 minutes and then tearing it down. So this is a very, very different way of managing your systems. And this can even be true with virtual machines. People are spinning up and destroying virtual machines from images in AWS in a very dynamic way. Now, through all of this, I feel sorry for anyone who's ever seen a diagram like this before. Through all of this, identity management will always be needed. And that's not going to go away. Because all of these different funnels, people love to get these identity management designs, but we'll always have to have HR, we'll always have to have users logging in, we always need authorization to determine who has access to what, and we always need to have a way to handle this. And businesses will always want to design these identity systems, understand how users interact, how they flow through with their custom HR and things like that. Now, something that we have seen, of course, is that businesses always want control of their data. We didn't end up with that great trusting model that was dreamed of in the past. Everyone wants their own silos. Google wants to own all of your identities. Twitter wants all your identities. Facebook wants all your identities. Universities want your identities. Bank wants your identities. This is why you end up with a password manager, because you have so many of the damn things. The idea of trusting other organizations is just not there. Now, come on, man. I was trying so hard to keep the straight face and keep going, but I couldn't. It was too much. Now, anyway, so everyone ended up with wanting their own data silo, and there's a lot of reasons for this. For some people, there's legal and risk compliance, which is one of those really hairy topics that no one really wants to talk about. It's not a fun topic, but legal compliance and risk compliance is a very major thing. From my perspective, from having been at a university, we were dealing with potentially people who were under the age of 18, which meant that we had to handle their data in a very specific way. And we also have to adhere with Australian laws around being an education provider and how we handle that. Banks have to deal with auditing and such, so on and so forth. So people have kind of from there, they've learned to outsource their problem though, because everyone loves outsourcing, right? And of course, with all these different models of computing where you've got on-site, cloud, and all these different evolutions, people are approaching this in different ways. And it really depends on the organization. Some people are going full cloud. Now, and this is talking about solutions like Auth0, Azure AD. Some people are even using Google's identity management system as their only identity silo for their business. So what this means is that a cloud provider can give you an off-the-shelf identity solution, and it's still within your business. You still get your data silo, but you don't need to run that infrastructure anymore. And this is very attractive to a lot of people because at the end of the day, the systems that we currently have require you to hire a full-time LDAP expert, and that's a full-time identity expert you're hiring, which is not a full-time developer you're hiring to work on your core business. Everything that is not your core business is now a loss. Everything that you're not putting into your core business is a waste of time and money. So people are outsourcing this to third parties. Some are going towards hybrid solutions. They still want to run on-premise infrastructure. They still want to have their own data centers, but they also may have cloud resources as well. So I did a short period of time at the University of Queensland as well. There's a real theme of me working at universities here. And they were very much running a system where they had half their infrastructure in Amazon and half their infrastructure in their own data centers. And this means that they had to synchronize and provide these identities in both sides of that set of resources so that we could actually get to those applications could actually provide identity management into their systems. And of course, some are self-managing this in a very different way. So some are doing things where they have their on-premise infrastructure and data centers, and from that they will expose something like Active Directory Federation Services, or ADFS as you'll more commonly hear it, or they're exposing things like Shibboleth or OAuth via something like Keycloak, and then when they consume these third-party applications, these are integrating with these web-fronted protocols. Now, through all of this, you're probably thinking, I came here for Samba. Why are we talking about all of these other things? And that's the thing, is that we really need to ask this question. Where do we fit in with this model? The world is moving in a very different way. How do we still retain relevance? Active Directory is very much designed for that static network model that we discussed earlier on. It's designed where you're enrolling all your domain members, you have your Kerberos system, and you have a centralized IT that controls everything. And arguably, so is what I work on in terms of the 389 directory server system. We're talking legacy LDAP. That has many of the same design constraints and ideas. Now, those networks, we've got to say, they're a solved problem, I think. I think that what Microsoft and Active Directory have done, and in terms of Samba as an Active Directory server, what they do for those networks is really good. And we already have will hear from success cases like Tranquility IT and Catalyst about the great work they're doing in solving those networks. But what about these dynamic systems? What about these cloud environments? How are those systems going to work? And how do we integrate with them in part as an open source identity community? Samba has arguably also had, I've heard from Andrew Bartlett, I don't know the exact details, but they've had successful use of Samba AD with the Azure AD connector. And this has allowed them to offer a hybridized identity solution for Azure infrastructure. But the whole world is not Azure as well. So what about our other applications? Let's think Linux now. Linux has a very different way of working to Windows and Azure AD. What if I'm spinning up dynamic VMs in AWS? What about my off-the-shelf web services? Samba doesn't integrate well with those out of the box. And even dynamic systems like our Kubernetes, how do we integrate our identities so that not only do we authenticate to OpenShift to administer it, but how do the applications running in those stateless environments actually then consume our identities? And I really think that the way that we think about this, we need to really change how we approach this. The idea, like we've always had this idea of being able to provide a single IDM solution, and I don't think we've ever been at that point. But it's really powerful to be able to say, here is our one identity management system. We don't have 3 bespoke directory servers that are replicating to each other in some synchronization tool. We really want to be able to say, here is our identity system. So to think about this problem, I backed this up because I've been challenging myself with these ideas and how we can deal with this in 389, but also Samba as well. So I think what was really important for me, and one of the things that I struggled with personally, was to put aside all the pre-existing ideas I had about how I would design a static network and how I'd integrate things. And it's really important that we consider the problem space and think about what are the parts that people are already using that solve this problem, and how can we consume those parts in a way that works well with what we have? What are the things that we need to extend, and how do we work in a way that's really good? So this problem space that I'm going to present here is a bit Unix focused and server-side, bring your own device. It's not so much desktop, things like that. Like I said, I think that's very solved. So the first point is that I think that every solution we have to come up with has to be human-centric. We need to think about the people that are interacting with our identity services at every level, and we also really need to consider the psychology and behaviors of people. People approach problems in a really different way, and a great example is doors. Have you ever been up to a door and you go up to it and you push and then you smack your face into the door and you go, oh, that's silly. And then you read the little label and it says, pull, and I feel so silly. It's not your fault. Everyone in their life has done this. It's not that you're silly. Humans have a psychology in the way that they interact with the world around them. These doors are called Norman doors. The door told you a set of signals about how you should interact with it, and you read them in exactly the way that your brain interprets them, but the door is not designed that way. And the thing is that thinking about this, we need to think about this as software engineers. We have a great power and responsibility to design systems that work with human psychology so that people can easily interact with them. Now, this is a very specific technology, but SSH keys, I think, are one of the most paramount things that we have to support in any solution. SSH is the de facto method of authenticating to a server. We cannot say that we are going to roll a bespoke service for authentication to a machine. It has to be SSH keys. And this fits really well with that usability theme. SSH keys do not involve a password. They mean that people will not make mistakes, and they're very secure from a cryptographic perspective. Now, the next thing we have to think about as well is, again, that applications and servers are stateless. And what this means is that we can't expect to, on the fly, generate state into those machines in the ways that we might otherwise do with a static environment. For example, domain joining may be out of the question. You can't domain join a container, for example. So we have to consider those stateless examples. I just saw one person in the audience shrug, and I would really like to see them give a demo of them domain joining a container. That would be excellent, but not in my talk. And those automation and dynamic environments where people are using things like Salt, Ansible, Puppet to manage their systems. And finally, BYOD is very popular and very much, in some cases, required. And we're really seeing the return of the thin client. We're seeing businesses put up iPads into their, commercial environments, where Google is now giving out Chromebooks for their software engineers, and that's the thin client as far as you can get. So how can we actually satisfy these conditions with Samba? Well, it turns out that Samba contains an LDAPS server, which happens to be a really cool thing. Let's use it. Samba provides a huge amount of things that we can really use here. It's a replicated user and group database. And what this means is that we can search for our users and groups and read them from a stateless application and trust that they are there. And to generate that trust, we can use certificates, which is a really effective way of securing the communication between the client to the server. And so we know that must be the Active Directory server that we want to communicate to, or the Samba server, I should say, in this, we're at a Samba conference after all. And we have that trust on that data. We can use things like SSSD and LDAP for distributing SSH keys to infrastructure. And again, because SSSD is reading and able to use it via the LDAP protocol with certificate authorities, we can use the SSSD client in a stateless manner, and we still manage to be able to distribute SSH keys. We can use OAuth for web integration, and one of the best things is that Samba still integrates with things like Radius and other enterprise applications. It doesn't change how our existing networks work, but we can now layer on a very dynamic environment inside as well, and it cooperates. And that's really important. Radius is like the thing. If you want Wi-Fi authentication and you're at a big business, it has to be Radius. It's the only option. And on every device you hold these days, MS Chat is the only actual authentication type that works, which means that you have to have Samba or AD. You can't get around that fact. If you want Radius to work, you need AD. That's it. So it's really important that we can still support that in our environment and what we offer. So let's go through a bit more technical examples on how we do this. I will make these slides available later, or I can publish this as a blog post or some kind of article so we can consume it. So if we're going to set up a domain controller to work in this environment, it's really important that we set it up so that it can handle the Unix attributes. So I've highlighted that one of the flags we need to use is the use RFC 2307. This makes sure that certain elements of schema are provided and configured correctly for your Unix applications to be able to read from them. And this is a really important part of that. Now, to help our anonymous clients, now I know this is going to be very divisive, this divisive topic, we set up anonymous binding. Now, this is one of those things that people do argue about, is anonymous binding okay? And I would argue it's fine. Kirchhoff's principle is that knowledge of the system does not weaken the system. So if I know who is an administrator, that does not weaken the administrative account. If I know who is in a group, that does not weaken the security of the group. And arguably, every pen test in existence, all you need to do is take over one machine with physical access, and you've already got the ability to read the entire domain. So having the ability to read the content of a domain does not give you security over what's happening in that domain. This is aside from things like privacy or whatever. That is, if there's compliance reasons, maybe that's fine. But in terms of most environments, this is okay. And the reason we want anonymous binding is this means that our stateless applications do not need cryptographic material or private material added into them when we are spinning them up. That's one less thing we have to do to make reliable dynamic environments that can be built on the fly. We don't need to think about it. And in order to do this, we actually just need to set this flag, basically. So this command is one of the very few patches that I actually have in Samba. I've done very little work on it. And setting this flag is how you turn on anonymous binding, which is very easy and user intuitive. I'm sure I would have known what this is if I hadn't have done it. So even though we can anonymously bind, we still can't read the data we need. Now, in order to do this, we need to set access controls so we can limit what the anonymous account can read. So we do this by setting the access control on the root DSE object, which allows anonymous to just read that. And then subsequently, we can then allow the users and built-in container to be read. Now, we don't give it to other containers like CN system or any of those others. We don't need that. We only need to be able to read users and groups. And there's a number of important users and groups inside of CN built in, which is why we give the read there. So to secure our communications now, we need to configure LDAPS. Now, start TLS has problems. It shouldn't be used. LDAPS is the only method of securing LDAP properly in terms of making sure your channels are secure, with the exception of Kerberos, of course. But to configure LDAPS is actually very easy. You just configure the certificates in var lib samba private, restart, you're good to go. This is fantastic, really easy. Anyone who's ever configured a Active Directory install to try and install certificates will know the absolute pain that configuring LDAPS into that environment is. So Samba makes this trivial, which is great. The next thing we need to do is we need to get support for our SSH key distribution. Now, Samba doesn't ship with this by default. I have patches on my laptop, but due to some health issues last year, I was not able to complete them. But I run this in another environment, it works. But we need to provide schema to support the LDAP server storing these SSH keys. So the first thing we need to do is find the current schema master. For those who are Active Directory administrators, you would know about the FSMO roles. For those who do not, there are a number of roles which is called FSMO or FSMO, as you might hear Australians call it, I think. Maybe in other countries, I've never known. But they stand for Flexible Single Master Operations. And what this means is that for these roles, only one server in a replication topology can change that data point. And this is how you provide serialization and guarantees that make sure that there is consistency within that cluster. So the first thing we do to configure this schema is we show the current FSMO roles in the environment. And we've run this command, and then of course we see that it is the server here, CN LDAP KDC, as a demo. We now log into this server, and we can add the flag in the configuration which says allow the schema to be updated. Restart, we can now apply things. Once you have completed this operation, it is best to remove this flag to prevent further schema updates. There are a number of things that need to be considered when you're doing schema updates in Active Directory, which is that schema is additive only. Once you add a schema element, you can never remove it. You can only subsequently append to it. So schema that you add has to be very carefully planned and added accordingly. I would hope that, as someone who does a lot of LDAP, that my schema, however, is adequately planned though, but I will allow other people to review that in time. So the schema that we add, which I'm sure that you'll all be quickly taking notes and writing this down, here is the schema we add, which is very simple. You would all be able to come up with this on a weekend. Now, what this does is this allows the use of storing SSH public keys inside of the directory, and it then does the subsequent parts, which allows attaching those to a Active Directory account. That's all it does. So that's it. We've now got a story for adding those keys. So now we can use the Samba tool, which has this really useful edit command. Now, I don't know about everyone else, but even as someone who works on LDAP, I hate LDIFs. The entire, like one of my life's goals is to make sure that no one in their right mind ever has to touch an LDIF ever again. They are the worst, single worst thing ever. And Samba, of course, has help with this because it comes with these great tools for usability, which makes it really easy to edit accounts. So in this case, we're going to edit them via a console, which is really useful for single case. If you're doing batch updates, you will need to come up with something else. And inside of that, all we have to do is with appropriate rights, we can add the, sorry, we're going to edit the user William here. Sorry, I've realized that I've got highlights on here and I forgot. We're going to add these two elements onto the object. And this object class says that it has a key. Again, this from the schema before. And then we actually provide the key into the attribute. That's it. So we now have SSH keys in our directory. Now we configure SSSD. Now I'm sure you're all looking forward to the fact that SSSD has part numbers in the top of the title. This is always a good sign. So SSSD is actually one of the really key things here about how we set up our VMs and how we do with user integration, because now we're bringing in not just the ability to get SSH keys, we're bringing in how we expose user identities, groups, authorization, authentication. So this is where it all starts to tie together for at least our Linux virtual machines. And we can generate this SSSD config file that we can very easily deploy and then work with. So the first thing is really important is this flag. Now, it sounds crazy, but if you don't add this ignore group members flag, SSSD tries to walk your entire LDAP server and resolve every single group end user's ID in your directory and causes a huge amount of server load. So this flag is really paramount to add. It's ignore group members. You just have to set it to false. There are so many stories. Please come and talk to me after. Now, the next thing we need to do with Active Directory is we need to set up LDAP referrals to false. And this is because SSSD will follow those referrals infinitely, because after every search, LDAP Active Directory offers a referral to itself. And SSSD will infinitely follow them. So we have to turn off LDAP referral following inside of SSSD, else terrible things will happen. I feel like this talk should have actually been called SSSD, how to integrate it with Active Directory, not using Active Directory's default LDAP, but mistakes were made. Now, the next thing is that what is actually really cool, now, it's not all doom and gloom. SSSD is actually fantastic. It does some really cool stuff. And what it does is it offers this LDAP ID mapping option. And what this means is that for your Active Directory accounts, you do not need to give them a UID number and a GID number. If it does not have one on the object, it will be generated and then based from the object GUID from Active Directory, Samba, sorry, and provided that account. If you need to override them, however, you can still set them onto the Active Directory, onto the LDAP objects, and SSSD will respect them. It's only where they're missing that this flag actually takes over and will automatically generate stuff. So again, that's one less piece of work that we have to do. We don't need to go through and retrospectively fix all of our objects to have IDs on them. We can just use Active Directory as is. And in fact, adding the RFC 2307 is only so that you can do the overrides if you have specific requirements. Now, episode 2 in SSSD, episode 2 is everyone's favorite, I'm pretty sure, is that we want to use private groups true. Now, all local account security on a Unix machine fundamentally expects that the user account and its primary group are essentially equivalent. Now, and I just saw some shocked looks in the audience. Now, this is the thing, is that if you set this up by default, what happens is that every user will be given the primary group of domain users. And in some cases, this can allow things like p-tracing or access to home drives. It can allow access to files in temp. There are a huge number of things that can go wrong. So for your security model of your users to be correct, you must assume that their primary group and their primary UID are equivalent. So instead of going, and so what some projects do, like FreeRPA, they actually have a plugin inside of the project where for every time you add a user, it also generates a group in parallel in order to solve this problem. But we can do this in a better way in Samba and Active Directory's environment. Instead, if you set this flag in SSSD assumes and on the fly generates a private group of the same details for every user. So we don't need to create a per user group inside of the directory. SSSD will generate it for us on the fly, which means that we've now provided proper isolation between our accounts. So for the final episode, which everyone is really looking forward to, this is where we integrate SSH keys. So what this flag here, the LDAP user SSH public key, this says to SSSD, here is the attribute where you will find SSH keys. And this allows SSSD to now look them up. Now, there's a whole bunch of other flags in these configs which are important. And again, I will try to make this all available so that if you want to replicate it, you can. I've just tried to touch on some of the key points. So the next part is that we want to configure SSH. So for SSH, we need to provide the authorized keys command. And what this does is it will just provide the username of the person who is logging in. SSSD will go to the directory, find their keys, come back, and then pass it back to SSH. There we go. We can now have our public keys distributed via LDAP. The next part is all of our web authentication and BYOD. Now, Samba doesn't have anything for this today. It doesn't have ADFS built in, but there are a number of also open source projects to provide this. The two major ones that I can think of off the top of my head is Keycloak, which is supported by Red Hat. It's a Java enterprise application, and it supports just about everything known to man. There's also the Ipsilon project, but unfortunately that's been a little bit unmaintained for a while, but is still in active production use as part of the Fedora project's admin services. And so it is still an option if maintaining it could be brought up to speed, and then potentially Samba could have its own ADFS implementation. I don't know. So again, what underpins these ideas is that simple and generic will always win. Like throughout all of time and all of computing, there is a big trend that the simplest and generic solution will win out. Complex artisanal solutions do not scale. It's hard to learn, and people want to achieve their own goals. I'm not, a business person a developer is not going to sit down and learn LDAP inside and out just to configure their application because they want to be developing their program. They want to plug in. They just want to plug in auth, move on. So we have to always consider that. Human interaction and design principles. Humans are involved at every level of our stack. People are working with SSH keys. Things are working in a dynamic way. People want, we have to consider things like keys and how they interact and what that user experience is going to be like and how we can make it really seamless and transparent. And finally, we have to have empathy for our users and admins. We can't give complex setup instructions to our administrators to set up these environments. We have to make these integrations simpler. And I think that even through all of this, there are still ways that we can improve Samba tool and SSSD to help with this. For example, Samba tool could generate the relevant SSSD config for your environment for anonymous clients. Just the same way that when you do a domain join, it generates the relevant WinBind or SSSD configs to do that authentication. So there's a lot of points where we could actually make these setup steps simpler. So now I want to touch on something else because I want to challenge everyone a little bit from here. Identities are always going to be relevant, and the way that we authenticate, is going to change. We've been using what you know for a long time. We've been using passwords for a long time. And we're starting to see a lot of cracks in that system if we haven't been seeing them for a long time. And the future of authentication, I think, is actually really changing. We're going to be starting to see keys a lot more. We're starting to see that authentication will become a lot more of what you have. Now, I've even got a YubiKey in my machine. There could be other people in here that have them. But it's not just about having these tokens, which is great for us. We're the 1% of technology. Like, we understand how all this works. We can go out and buy these keys and empower ourselves. But what about everyone else in this world? Well, for them, things are changing. iPhones are soon going to enable their Touch ID in their phones to work as a WebAuthn token. And this really changes from what you know to and what you are to what you have. And similarly, Face ID will be used for this as well. And I believe that there has been or will be, I'm sorry, I was a bit unwell, a talk on Windows Hello. And Windows Hello will, in some situations, work as a WebAuthn device as well. And this really changes the dynamic. We're not going to have a situation where I authenticate to the device. It's not that I authenticate to a device which also authenticates to the server and the device gets authenticated to. It's I authenticate to my device and it continues to authenticate me on my behalf. The device becomes part of your authentication and being a part of your authentication rather than just a channel which you go through. Now, this is awesome in terms of human usability and design. It protects from most phishing. Unlike the TOTP tokens, which can still be phished, hardware devices which involve cryptography, these involve ECDSA, and the touch basically has a secure element which when you touch, it then releases it so that a cryptographic operation can be performed. Now, this basically eliminates phishing on a huge amount of levels. It completely in one step removes weak passwords. And it removes a huge number of human interaction failures. We don't have people sticking passwords on their screens anymore because their device is their authentication. So it really changes the threat landscape and security, how this will be rolled out. And of course, how this is going to work in a corporate environment is a really different thing. And this is what, I've forgotten his name, unfortunately, he would have been talking about with the corporate version of Face ID for Microsoft is. And I think that it's one of those things that we really need to consider how we can support these tools in our software. So this asks the question, what's really next for open source identity management? What can we do? How can we work with these devices as they change and come out? And really what is next from the integrations that we currently have today to what we can be doing and integrating with in the future? And of course, what will Samba look like in 10 years' time? How will its Active Directory system look like in 10 years, and how will these integrations work? So I'm a little bit early, but for the purposes of the audio recording, my email is wbrown@suse.de, spelt like the color. And I'd like to thank you all for listening to me ramble about things. And I guess I have time now for questions. I think I'm a little bit early. Everyone's scared. I have stickers. I can bribe you. If you ask a question, I'll give you a triple SD or a 389 LDAPS sticker. If the question's good, I'll give you both. Oh, there we go. We've got one taker. Or do you just want the sticker?
Yeah, as you said before, or in the beginning of your presentation, it's more and more relevant to actually not just have one directory, which is the only directory for a company. You want to kind of integrate with other directories, for example, with Azure, with AWS, etc. And in case of Microsoft, you have tools that make that very easy. For example, to synchronize your local AD with Azure. I was just wondering, where do we stand on this with Samba?
I will direct you to a much better person who's named Andrew over here. Andrew has told me that there was a successful case of Samba AD integrating with Azure AD. The specific details I do not know, but I think that it would be really awesome if that kind of thing was part of the Samba project as a whole, because that would enable a lot of interactions and a lot of business integrations that don't exist today. So I think if you want to know more, he might be the person to talk to, as he is the Active Directory genius. There's actually a number of other people from Catalyst who are here as well, and they might be able to help you as well. So probably go and find them. Here you go. As promised, stickers. I'll give the microphone to the audio people. Yep. Kai?
Perfect. Okay, so going back to you can't like join a container into Active Directory. What's the pain point you see there?
DNS and Kerberos. That's what it comes down to, is that a lot of these systems, so it's not just that actually. Kerberos has a lot of opinions about DNS, and that's fine. Like, that's part of its security model and how it works. But if you have a container environment, you have an automation engine, and that automation engine is going to be spinning up and down containers very rapidly in a very dynamic way. They tend to be on isolated networks which are behind load balancers. They may not have access to your AD. And now you need to have security material inside of your automation that will do the domain join on container launch. And so as a result, there's a whole bunch of automation steps in there which people do not want to tackle, because Kerberos, just like LDAP, is a difficult technology. Everything that is not solving a developer's problem is in the way of their solution. So if they need to spend time solving a Kerberos integration problem, that's not solving the application deployment problem. So what they're going to do is those containers are going to spin up and down. They're going to integrate with something like OAuth, and then it's the OAuth server's problem to deal with Kerberos. And that's where it's just, there's no benefit to putting Kerberos in the container, because your security is going to come from the OAuth model, from the OAuth server onto the side, and your container is not going to care. So it's possible, but no one's going to do it.
Okay, fair enough. That I can buy.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah.
No, because I was thinking. I mean, like a lot of the other problems in sort of like you need a dedicated machine that like Kerberos expects you to live on and everything, so you can do all the DNS stuff and everything. That you can solve with one of the networking layers, right? Because there's a lot of networking layers for Docker and Kubernetes and so on, like Flannel and whatever else, whatever the cool thing of this month is called. And so that I think you could do. But I agree, sort of like the automation is going to be a bit of a pain point.
Yeah, and it's not just that. It's when I go to a website, I don't authenticate with Kerberos. Because if I'm a student at a university, I don't have Kerberos integrations on there. So I'm going to go to an OAuth portal, and then that's going to take me through the application. There's no need for it to have Kerberos material in there at all. So,
sure, but in an enterprise case, you could actually authenticate using Kerberos, because there's a Kerberos, so HTTP to Kerberos proxy that you could use to get your tickets.
Yeah, but you can do that. But again, as a student, I'm not going to configure my laptop. I can't configure my iPad to do this. I can't configure my Chromebook to do it. Suddenly we run into these integration problems where Kerberos has no place on the client machine. Kerberos is very quickly becoming a server-to-server protocol. And what it does is fantastic. Like, there's nothing technically wrong with Kerberos at all. It's fantastic. It's just that getting it onto client machines is really difficult because of usability issues. So anyway, would you like your stickers?
Sure.
See, no one's worked out that you could just say your question is, can I have stickers? That would also be valid. No one's worked it out yet.
So what changes do you propose to Samba to embrace this world? You've talked about all sorts of technologies around it and ways of configuring it and all the rest. But is Samba already just perfect for this world? We'll go home, have pizza, or are there things that we need to do?
So if I was, had unlimited time and energy, which sadly I do not, the things that I would do to help this, I would probably write ADFS for Samba. I would have that well integrated into the project, and that would basically be where you would hook in to get WebAuthn working, and to handle that. You could then store everything nicely in the public keys and stuff from the tokens when the enrollment into directory, and that's all replicated nicely, and that's handled well. So having ADFS for that would be one of them. Samba also has the luxury of it's not AD. You can do things differently to AD. So again, I wanted to provide those schema elements by default, and you know what? I did that a year ago. I still haven't committed those patches. That's on me. That's my responsibility. That's something which, out of the box, Samba can add as a value over AD by having those things by default. And generally, I think that most of these things are just little things. In terms of the Unix side with the anonymous parts, that's fine. It's really that ADFS, getting the schema, maybe even a tool that allows generating the stateless SSSD config in addition to having a domain join tool for stateless clients. That would be another really valuable addition to something like Samba tool. So that way, it makes that onboarding of people to use this a lot easier to do. And I don't think any of it's rocket science. It's just time and doing it. And, working with users and system administrators to say, look, what are your requirements in these environments to work? So another really cool one that, outside of the realm of this talk is making it so that the DNS, having dynamic DNS integrations so that automation tools like Kubernetes can then actually use Samba AD as its DNS provider and then have those really nice dynamic integrations. So I think Samba AD gives a huge amount, and that's why I said it does so much. It's just all those little small parts at the end of the line that are really hard to do because time and everything else.